Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another wonderful evening with a fantastic author. I have to tell you, we've had some technological issues. Poor Andrew, he has this wonderful, you're just going to have to use your imagination. He has this wonderful PowerPoint that he wanted to share with great pictures. It just means you're going to have to get the book because you need to see all the wonderfulness in the book. We're all kind of tired of the technological stuff anyway, so Crowdcast is conspiring against us tonight. I don't think it's us. I do think it's them. But Andrew is fascinating, so I'm not too worried. You know, you won't be distracted by his PowerPoint. He's just going to have to entertain us with his charm and his knowledge. And he's very knowledgeable. This is not his first book. This is his third book, Under Jerusalem. He's a journalist and a science writer, and so he knows what he's talking about, and we feel very honored to have you. I thank you for joining us, and I thank you for your flexibility while, they didn't see us all pulling our hair out. So, we've all got our body parts in place and we're ready to party here. So thank you. So we're just going to have a great conversation. I think the first question is how, you decided that the way to get to understanding this amazing city of Jerusalem, that is the focus of three major religions and the center of much conflict in the world, how you decided that the best way to get there was underground.
Great question. And I should say, if you had told me that I was going to write a book called Under Jerusalem, I'll give you the full title. It's Under Jerusalem, the Buried History of the World's Most Contested City. If you'd said I was going to do anything about Jerusalem, I would have said, you're crazy. All the politics, all the religion mixed up with that science. I avoided Jerusalem like the plague for a couple of decades. I've been writing about Near Eastern archaeology and Central Asian archaeology since before the Iraq War. And then at some point I was visiting Israel for an archaeology conference, and an archaeologist I ran into said, hey, let's go to Jerusalem for a day. And I had an extra day. I thought, okay, that'll be fun. He likes good food and good wine. I thought we'll have a little stroll, nice lunch. What could go wrong? I never got lunch.
Oh, that's terrible.
It was bad. I hate missing lunch, but I was distracted enough not to think about it much because this archaeologist took me down below the streets of Jerusalem into archaeological sites I didn't know existed. And I'd been to Jerusalem, I'd visited sites, I'd written a few stories here and there, and I thought I knew what was going on. And I was stunned and shocked to see the extent of the digs that are going on beneath the city today. And so that was a piece of it. And I thought, well, that's a great story. So I did a story for National Geographic magazine on these digs and what's going on. And then I started to find out that when I was underground, there were these tunnels and trenches that were done way, way before in the 19th century. And I thought, well, who were these people? So that's when I began to do my own digging to find out who were the people who began to dig in the first place in Jerusalem, and what were they doing there, and what did they find, and how does that relate to the Jerusalem today? And that's when I stumbled on what I think makes this book really unique. Is it's a really fresh way to see how Jerusalem became the contested city, the most contested city in the world that it is today. And it all links back to these early explorers.
And who were these early explorers? Introduce us to our, 19th century early, not really archaeologists in the way we know them today, but, right. Biblical treasure hunters, really.
Yeah. This is the characters are really amazing. They're British, they're French, they're Russian. There's a German cuckoo clock repairman who plays a really key role in discovering whether or not Jesus was buried in the Holy Sepulchre. And a cast of other, really unusual people. A British aristocrat, we can talk about that at some point, who brought in a Swiss psychic to find the Ark of the Covenant. So what I discovered were these fascinating people who all were a little obsessed. And most of them were obsessed not just with Jerusalem, but with the Bible, with finding ancient remains. And as you say, there weren't really archaeologists back in those days. These were explorers, or treasure hunters that were looking for cool stuff. And they didn't have a sense of digging levels and trying to understand pottery types and all those kind of boring, but really important things that archaeologists do today. They were looking for the Ark of the Covenant, for the temple treasures, for the tomb of David and Solomon. They were looking for all the things they'd read about in Sunday school, because I say Sunday school because most of these were in fact Protestants who began the search beneath the city.
So how much damage did they do to these archaeological sites from a scientific perspective as they pursued treasure and just pushed everything else out of the way?
No, great question. So one of my favorite characters is Charles Warren. Now, Charles Warren was somebody that today we would say was addicted to extreme sports. He was the first person to climb the Rock of Gibraltar without a rope. I mean, this guy was nuts. He was a military officer for the British, and he was chosen to go to Jerusalem, to go beneath the city to map what was underneath. And this required somebody who was a great cartographer, who had a taste for adventure, and who didn't mind mucking around in the sewage that really took up most of the underground space in Jerusalem in those days. So in order for him to do the mapping of the ancient tunnels and passages that were underground, he used gunpowder every now and then. And now just imagine you're at home having dinner and suddenly you hear, your house rumbles because there's an explosion beneath the floor. And that's what was happening. So mostly in the Muslim quarter, right next to what Jews call the Temple Mount and what Muslims call the Noble Sanctuary. It's Islam's third holiest site. So he was setting off underground gunpowder charges beneath some of the holiest places on earth. And of course, this created some antipathy. Both Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem weren't really keen on these crazy heretical Protestants showing up and digging underneath their homes and their sacred sites.
So whose permission did he need to do that, or did he not need anyone's permission in those days?
Oh, no, you definitely needed permission. And that had to come from the Sultan himself. So the Sultan was the leader of the Ottoman Empire. So from about 1517 to 1917, for almost exactly 500 years, Jerusalem was under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. And they were an Islamic, they were Muslims. They were Turkic-speaking Muslims, very different from the Arabs who were living in Jerusalem. And so you had to get permission from the Sultan. And the Sultan was happy to give permission to the British and the French and the Russians. Why? Well, he didn't really care about science or about treasure hunting. He wanted to keep the Europeans happy. He wanted to do them a favor because at that point, the Ottoman Empire needed the money and the resources and the technology from Western Europe. And he wanted to stay on the good side of the British and the French in particular because the Russians were pressing the Ottoman Empire from the north. So this was all high power politics of the 19th century, which of course today we see being repeated in some ways in the whole fight over Ukraine and Russia. So it really was politics that was driving the Sultan's agreement to allow these foreigners to come in and dig in this ancient city.
There's always an argument in the sciences about, how politics affects the science and how the science affects the politics. So you've talked about how the politics affect the science, but how did the science affect the politics? Because it seems like that was the impetus for a lot of conflict between who was digging for what. And, the Jews were happier than the Christians or the Muslims, and all the conflict seems to be, bubbling up from underneath the ground under Jerusalem.
Yeah, quite literally. And, this is what makes Jerusalem so fascinating. Because there are plenty of other places I've written about, Babylon or Thebes in ancient Egypt, or Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus River Valley, great ancient cities and the centers of great civilizations. But Jerusalem is different. And it's different because anything you do there today has implications for politics and religion. So from the very beginning, the people who were digging beneath Jerusalem were not just trying to answer scientific questions. They were wrapped up in the politics and the religious movements of the moment. The British, for example, when they first arrived, and they're the ones who really did the most work in Jerusalem in the 19th century, their focus really was on unearthing the Old Testament, finding these places in the Old Testament that they knew so well from Sunday school. And so their focus was really on the prophets, on David and Solomon, Whereas, say, the Catholics and the Greek Orthodox, they were more focused on the New Testament. So right there, you have people, their scientific focus was in part tied to their religious backgrounds. And that is still true today.
So when did the more scientific archaeology come on board and affect how these sites were being excavated?
Well, that's when the first American comes on the scene. Now, there were a couple before him, but the American who really revolutionized archaeology in Jerusalem and made it not just treasure hunting, but made it a science, was named Frederick Bliss. Fascinating guy. His father had helped to found the American University in Beirut. So he grew up in Beirut, spoke fluent Arabic, went to Jerusalem for the British. He's American, but the British hired him because he had worked with some of the great archaeologists of the day, including one, Flinders Petrie, who's a fascinating character who first figured out that if you dig down, you can find levels. And those levels, at the oldest levels, tend to be down here, the newer levels up here. Sounds obvious, but at the time it was revolutionary to go through and dig slowly. And rather than look for a palace or for gold or silver, you're actually trying to understand what period was laid down when. And so this allowed archaeologists for the first time to really begin to understand how to date these levels. So suddenly, these bits of pottery, which people would just toss aside as trash, became the real scientific goal. Because by having these bits of pottery, you could figure out who made that pottery and when and what levels they were at. So you could really create a chronology. You could understand if something was laid down in 1500 BC and then this was 1200 BC. So for the first time, you really could read history. And so this was first applied to Jerusalem in the 1890s by Frederick Bliss, who was trying to find the city of David. That was the city that King David in the Bible is said to have conquered sometime around 1000 BC. And then, of course, his son Solomon turns it into a grand city in the biblical text. So this was the first time archaeology really came into its own during those days in the 1890s.
So what happens when the obvious conflict comes where the timeline of the Bible doesn't support the timeline of the archaeology, or the timeline of the archaeology obviously doesn't support the timeline of the Bible, and the story of the Bible is not supported by the archaeological finds? How does that explode? That sounds more explosive than putting bombs underneath the site.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways it actually is, because the funny thing about biblical archaeology, it's a very odd thing. I mean, the rest of archaeology is just archaeology, but there's this subfield called biblical archaeology. And it was actually founded by an American who came to Jerusalem in the 1840s. He didn't dig, but he did do measurements and examine, because he wanted to use the tools of science, that is, measuring things, looking at etymologies of words to see if, say, this village or this well outside of Jerusalem is mentioned in the Bible. Is it the same place? Do Arabs today use the same name? So he was trying to prove the Bible, prove the accuracy of the Bible by using the tools of science. And remember, this is at this fascinating time when geologists and biologists are beginning to challenge the thoughts and ideas in the Bible, the explanation of how the world came to be. So it was a very clever way to you take the tools of science, this new science, and turn it to try and prove faith. And this, of course, is controversial because some people said, well, faith is faith. You don't prove faith. But in this time of the Enlightenment, when people are really focused on gathering data and looking at it and trying to understand, this really became the raison d'etre, the real purpose of biblical archaeology well into the 20th century. So it makes the digging in Jerusalem kind of unique, because you have these people who often were missionaries, who often were pastors, rabbis, who were actually doing the excavations.
So you make it sound like it's all in the past. Are there not any still biblical treasure hunters out there trying to compete with archaeologists? I imagine there are.
Oh my God. Oh yeah. I mean, this is the place that gave us the true Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now there's several I could name going back to the early 1900s. But as recently as when I was there right before the pandemic, I ran across this quite interesting rabbi who was from Brooklyn but was living in Jerusalem and was a rabbi of a part of Jerusalem called Mount Zion. And he had gotten together with one of his students who was a very wealthy Australian mining operator who'd been involved in arms deals and wine and had made a lot of money. And together they were really focused on finding the Ark of the Covenant and the temple treasures, which they believed were buried under this particular area in Jerusalem. And actually, he got involved with the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And the Israeli Antiquities Authority is the governmental body that grants dig licenses to people who want to dig in Jerusalem, much as the Sultan did 100 years ago. And so they began to work with the Israeli Antiquities Authority, but even for these Antiquity Authority archaeologists, they said, this is too far out for us, and they've kind of pulled out. But the point is that the search for these treasures is not just something in the past, it is still going on today. Both Jews and Christians of many stripes are eager to find these treasures, which they're convinced still lay beneath the city.
So those of us in Florida are familiar with the underwater archaeology of Mel Fisher. He brings up Spanish galleon and all these amazing things. And then there's a huge legal battle about who owns the artifacts.
Yes.
Whether it's the state, whether it's the federal government, whether it's the treasure hunter, and who owns that. How does that play out in Jerusalem? I can imagine that there's some pretty heated debates about who has the right to have these artifacts once they're found, whether it's by an archaeologist or a treasure hunter.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when these Christian archaeologists from Western Europe first were showing up in the 1860s and 70s, I mean, this was purely a Western Christian effort. And then by the 1880s and 90s, the Jews of Europe who were reading in the newspapers about the attempts by these Christians to find things like the Ark of the Covenant, they said, well, wait a second. Why should Christians be allowed to dig for what are sacred Jewish objects? It's our heritage. So Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who was a very wealthy French banker, he bankrolled an expedition, the first Jewish-led expedition to Jerusalem to try and get these treasures before the Christians could get them. So right there you have this fascinating competition between Jews and Christians, Western Jews and Christians, who are trying to snag these treasures and both claiming them. They're both hoping they could get them because they both felt like they were of their heritage. So from the beginning, the fight over who owns what's beneath Jerusalem has been quite vivid and quite violent at times. And of course, today, it's never been more true than today when you have the Israeli Antiquities Authority working underground, often beneath Muslim homes. And many Muslims complain that these digs are damaging their homes. And I went into some homes and saw cracks. And now the Israelis say, no, it's not our fault. But it's clear that there's a lot of tension. So what you see below ground, as fascinating as it is, you really have to lift your eyes up and also see how it's connected to what's going on above ground. And that's been true since the 1860s.
That's why this is such a fascinating way to get to this very conflicted area, as you say, the most contested city in the world, by being underground. So are there things that you can mark, like things changed in 1948 and then things changed with, the PLO and the Palestinian claims that, to land on the West Bank? I mean, do those things all show up in these archaeological battles?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I didn't write a book about the history of Jerusalem or the political history of Jerusalem. That's been done by plenty of other people. What interested me is how the archaeological history of Jerusalem, how this search for ancient Jerusalem has made Jerusalem the contested city it is today. So I divided my book into three pieces. The first are these first Western Christians who show up, who are trying to recreate the Old Testament and find what is beneath the streets to kind of bolster the Christian faith. And then in 1917, the British took over. So finally, the British were actually in control of the whole city. But for the next 50 years, Jerusalem was a mess. Jews and Arabs were fighting with each other. And finally, as you mentioned, 1948, when Israel was created, Jerusalem was divided, and most of the old city, where kind of the cool old stuff is, that fell under Jordanian or Arab control. So it really wasn't until 1967. So the key moment is really in the Six-Day War, 1967, when the Israelis take over all of Jerusalem. And then for the next few years, the Israeli archaeologists have their first opportunity to really dig in the old city. And of course, their focus is on that ancient Jewish past. So that's when the archaeology gets, let's say, way more complicated and interesting, because you have these immense digs involving hundreds of people unearthing thousands of artifacts, producing a whole new picture of ancient Jerusalem.
So I should say to people, you should submit your questions. I mean, I have a million questions, and Andrew and I could go on forever and just pretend you're not there, but you are there. And so I'm sure that you have questions. So please, you can write them on the side, or you can put them and ask a question. And I'm sure that Andrew would be happy to have another voice other than mine just ringing in his ears. Much of the review, many of the reviews of your book very kindly and amazingly say how even-handed the book is, and that seems like almost an impossibility in this part of the world. So congratulations on that. And
I have to say that was the biggest surprise and the biggest relief I think I've had in my life as an author, because anything you write about Jerusalem is going to be controversial, because you have these very strict narratives. You have a Jewish narrative, a Muslim narrative, and a Christian narrative, and within those you've got many different viewpoints, of course. But people are really, this is about belief. This is about people's religious beliefs. So when you bring that together with a place that is so hotly contested politically, and then you throw in these issues about science, then it gets really dicey. So my goal was to try and talk about the people who have tried to unearth ancient Jerusalem. And in doing that, I think I unspool a new way of understanding this conflict, which I think for many, particularly many Americans, is very hard to understand and hard to grasp. And who wants to read a big, thick book about people who are fighting? So instead, my approach is to really give this history of Jerusalem a new twist that makes it, I think, clear, and I think, and it's almost, maybe I can say, even enjoyable to unspool how Jerusalem got to be the city it is today.
Well, it's such a longer and richer history. In America, we say at 50 years, you're a national treasure and you're eligible to be on the National Register. 50 years is just a nanosecond or a minute when you're talking about the Middle East and Jerusalem and Israel. So I think that time span is overwhelming for a lot of people to comprehend. In the spirit of full disclosure, I should tell you I'm trained as an anthropologist, but as a cultural anthropologist, although really? I was forced to take some archaeology in the approach. And I always found that people were more interesting when they were alive and they could still lie. Whereas in archaeology, the facts are the facts, just the facts, ma'am, and you can't make stuff up. So did that make it easier for you to be even-handed, even though you're telling people stories that you've got the hard evidence, basically?
No, I mean, what really surprised me was that when I was researching these older archaeologists, long dead archaeologists, and then talking to the ones today, what I was struck by was how similar their stories really are. That they all are usually a little odd, they're a little obsessed, they're often quite brilliant. They have very thick skins, because in order to work in Jerusalem, you got to be tough. You have to be willing to take a lot of political pressure, a lot of heat, sometimes actual violence aimed at you from both Muslims and Jews. I mean, there was a period in the 1980s where Israeli archaeologists working in Jerusalem were subject to being stoned, being insulted. I mean, they often were given police escorts because there was so much hatred among, very traditional Jews who didn't want to see any digging happen because of fears of desecrating graves. And that goes back to the 1860s. In fact, the very first legal dig in Jerusalem, took place in what's called the Tomb of the Kings, right outside of the Old City. It's the most incredible tomb in Jerusalem. It's way cooler in a lot of ways than the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional site of Jesus's death. And in this tomb, this Frenchman found the sarcophagus and had it shipped back to the Louvre, where it became a sensation, kind of like the King Tut show of the 1860s. And he also took back the bones of what clearly was a royal woman buried in it. And
Yeah.
so the Jewish community said, hey, you are desecrating our ancestors. This is outrageous. But again, the Sultan in Istanbul was more interested in good relations with the French Empire than he was with, keeping the Jews of Jerusalem happy. So from that beginning, the very first dig, you have this real antipathy, this real, let's say, ambiguity about whether archaeology is a good thing or a bad thing. Is it desecrating other people's heritage, or is it bringing to light, or is it being used to push a particular political agenda? And the answer is all of these are true.
So nobody could take things out now and put them in the Louvre, though, right?
No, in fact, there's a really interesting coda to this story. So I mentioned this Frenchman who dug in the 1860s. So how long ago? It's 160 years ago. It's a long time ago. It's been in the Louvre ever since. You can go now to the Louvre and see the sarcophagus. It's still there. Now, the question is, what happened to the bones? And recently, a group of Jewish rabbis in Jerusalem have sued the French government, as well as the Louvre Museum, demanding a return of the sarcophagus, as well as the remains of this queen who was buried within this stone casket. Now, the Louvre is saying, well, we don't have any records of those remains. We don't know where they are. And so it's caused quite a bit of tension between the Israeli government and the French government. So here you have a dig that took place more than 150 years ago that's causing a lot of tension between two major world powers.
Well, it doesn't sound dissimilar to the battle between Native Americans and the museums in the United States of trying to reclaim burials and artifacts and things from the past.
Right.
So, without trying to guide you with my questions, because that's my agenda. What stories did you want to share with us that were part of your PowerPoint? You're going to have to let the words paint the picture, as they say on NPR.
Well, let's see. One thing I found that readers tend to, and it talks, people are very interested in, is like how I explore Jerusalem myself. So I spent about 3 years going back and forth from the U.S. to Jerusalem, and I stayed typically in the Christian quarter, because in Jerusalem everything's political. So if people say, "Where are you staying?" it's not just a curious question. They want to know: are you staying in the Muslim part of town? Are you staying in the Jewish part of town? These are the two main areas of East and West Jerusalem. So I chose to stay sort of in the middle, in the Christian quarter, within the Old City. I wanted to be within the Old City, partly because the commute was easy to the digs, but also I wanted to get the experience of what it was like to actually be in the city and to do my shopping. So I would go to the little local grocery store on the Via Dolorosa in the Old City for my groceries. And one day I'm in there, and the Muslim owner, so you're in the Christian quarter, but it's a Muslim grocery store. And he said, "So who are you? You're not a tourist. I see you all the time." And I told him, and he laughed, and he walked over to the potato chip aisle, lifted a hatch up, and then vanished. So I put my groceries down. What am I going to do? And I followed him down this ladder that went into this, what I thought would be like a little basement. Instead, I entered into this enormous, cavernous, ancient Crusader hall.
Oh my gosh.
With huge arches that stretched so far that my little iPhone light could not reach the end of it. It was extraordinary, and it backed up right against the Holy Sepulchre. His neighbor was the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional tomb of Christ. So I'm like, what in the world is this place? And so over time, as I got to know him, and I came back and visited the place, and then I discovered that this had been an incredible political blow up that had happened 20 years before, when a young prime minister named Benjamin Netanyahu had just become prime. It was his first crisis. And what happened was, this Muslim shop owner's father who's since passed away, had gone into the store one day and had heard noise down below. And he lifted up the hatch of what was just his basement, and he saw a bunch of drunken Coptic monks. These are Egyptian Christian monks who were partying in his basement. And so there was this little scuffle between the Muslims upstairs and the Copts downstairs, and the police were called. And then it really got nasty. It turned into a full-scale battle between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli state. And helicopters had surrounded Ramallah, and there was this hullabaloo. And I won't give you all the details because that's a wonderful chapter in my book. But the point is that this was just my local grocery store. So that's where you can go to Jerusalem. You can go to the famous tunnels, the Western Wall tunnels, the pilgrimage road. You can visit these sites, but there are innumerable other places that have these immense underground spaces that otherwise are invisible.
So what languages do you speak that gets you this access?
I speak the international language of show me something cool. No, I mean, I'm fortunate in that so many people in Jerusalem actually are very fluent in English. Both Arabs and Jews tend to be almost everybody I meet there, and certainly anybody, any archaeologists that you talk to. I mean, I speak just enough Arabic to be really dangerous, and my Hebrew is horrible. But a little German, a little French, a little English, and you can always get through. So it's unlike a lot of places in the world where you really do need to know the local language, because Jerusalem is a pilgrimage city, because it's a city that depends on tourists. People are very multilingual, and it's one of the lovely things about Jerusalem is that you have people who can shift back and forth between 3 or 4 languages. It's not uncommon. Armenians who can speak Coptic, who can speak traditional, Jerusalem Arabic, who can speak Hebrew. So you have to know these languages there if you live there to survive.
What about the archival research, though? Did you need to be able to read in different languages?
No, unfortunately, most of them were in English. Some French. I can read some French and German. So English, French, and German pretty much covered it, because most of the Jewish archaeologists, there really weren't that many working in Jerusalem until, as I mentioned, 1967. And most of those papers are all in English as well as in Hebrew. And when it comes to the Palestinians, to Arab archaeologists, there are very, very few. And that's an interesting story, because actually back in the 1940s, under the British mandate, when the British ran Jerusalem, there were pretty equal numbers of Palestinian Arabs and Jews working in the cultural heritage department. But it's interesting, and this is important, because the Jews tended to focus on traditional archaeology like they do in the West. Most of them were Ashkenazi. Most of them came from Europe. They came from the universities. They'd studied archaeology. Whereas the Palestinians were more focused on what's above ground, the cultural heritage, the old houses, their shrines. And so there's a very, very different understanding of the past between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. And that is something that nobody, as far as I could find, had really talked about. So I was fascinated to see that Palestinians really view their heritage as what's above ground. It's about expanding the mosque. It's about fixing up the old house. It's less about digging below, because from their point of view, you are your heritage. You don't have to go looking for it. So for me, that gave me some real insight into the cultural differences that often go unmentioned in this fight over Jerusalem.
But is there some sense that if you can find that heritage underground, it gives you some special claim to what's above ground?
Oh, absolutely. But see, this is a Western idea. See, from what I can make out, both Jews and Christians and Muslims who lived in Jerusalem 100 years ago, they didn't think this way. This is an idea that was imported from the West. This is an idea that comes from the Western Christians who showed up wanting to find that biblical Jerusalem, right? And in doing that, they placed their claim on Jerusalem as a Christian city, as a city that should be run by a Christian colonial power. And then in the 20th century, later in the 20th century, when you have the creation of Israel, and then later the conquering of Jerusalem, of all of Jerusalem, by Israel, and the annexation of it, you have something that's somewhat similar, and that is digging that is often used. The results of the digging are often used to stake that claim, to say Jerusalem is a Jewish city. We have the proof. Here we have the remains from the time of Herod. It shows it was a very powerful and important city that was ruled by Judeans. So it really is interesting to me that you have that the science can be really good or really bad. It doesn't particularly matter. But the politicians on all sides are going to use their finds in order to stake their current claim to the city.
Right.
So the past is constantly being used for the present. And that's very different from most religions.
Yes, I mean they're using the archaeology to justify the presence and their political positioning at the moment.
Right.
What would you say was the biggest thing that surprised you when you started this journey?
Well, I have to say that one of the things that most shocked me was that most of the digging going on in Jerusalem is not done by Israeli archaeologists. And it's not done by anybody who has an official license. It's secret digging that is going on all the time. And all you have to do is walk through the old city on a Saturday. That's the Jewish Sabbath. And that's when the Israeli Antiquities Police is not keeping as close of an eye on what's happening as they would on every other day. And so you see these big bags filled with soil that are sitting outside waiting to be picked up by the trash. And what are these bags? Well, yeah, they're people that are building, adding a room, or they're trying to create a deeper cellar so they can store stuff, or, it's a city where it's hard to get a building permit. And so a lot of illicit digging is going on because of the mistrust between the archaeologists, who are Israeli and mostly Jewish, almost all Jewish in Jerusalem, and the Palestinians who actually are living in places like the Muslim Quarter. So I think it's kind of an unseen tragedy that because of this conflict, we're losing a lot of important data about ancient Jerusalem. It's just vanishing quietly. And I don't know how to resolve that, but I think it's good to shine some light on it. And it's not just a Palestinian problem or an Israeli problem. It's really a problem of a city where the politics is so intense that cultural heritage is being destroyed as a result.
And in the same line of questioning, is there any character you ran across that you're the most fond of or you feel the most connection to?
Well, I don't know about fond, but certainly I have a place in my heart for Montague Parker, who was really the guy who started the Raiders of the Lost Ark craze. And he was a British aristocrat who in the early 1900s, he was bored, he had too much money, he was a veteran from the Boer War in Africa, and he got hooked up with this crazy Finnish theologian poet who thought he had uncovered the key in Ezekiel that told you exactly where the Ark of the Covenant was buried in Jerusalem. And so he put together the nuttiest excavation team. I won't say archaeology team because they forgot to hire an archaeologist. And they began to dig. They even brought the guy who built the London Tube to engineer vast tunnels beneath Jerusalem. I mean, this guy was really, and at the same time, they were having fun. They were drinking, they were gambling, they were, they rented a big house. His best friend, who was a cricket star, was with him. They had this Swiss psychic. It was just this madcap adventure. But there was a shadow side to this, and that was he got so desperate to find the treasure because all these investors had poured money into this, that at the end, he bribed the guard in the noble sanctuary, the Temple Mount, and went in there for a week at night, and he and his guys hacked away at the sacred rock beneath the Dome of the Rock, beneath that golden dome. Third holiest site in Islam. It's sacred to many Jews. It's possibly the site where the temple was located. And he got found out, chased out of town. And again, you might say, well, that's kind of a funny story, except what it did had huge implications, because this crazy rogue British aristocrat so angered Muslims around the world that the British Empire actually feared there was going to be a mass rebellion. People were so angry that Jerusalem had been desecrated. And it also had another effect, that was to convince the Palestinian Arabs who were living under under the Sultan, under the Ottoman Empire. It convinced them that they couldn't trust that Sultan to take care of their sacred site, that they needed to take care of it. And that was the beginning of Palestinian nationalism. And that's the fight between Jews and Arabs really goes back to that point.
Well, that's fascinating. We have not so many questions as comments. The first one is fascinating with an exclamation point. I think everyone would agree. And then someone tells us, I was so fortunate to travel to Israel for the first time in 2016 during Purim in Jerusalem. I stayed in a Jerusalem hotel for my whole stay and went on tours. It was unforgettable. I don't know that anybody's ever taken a trip to Israel or Jerusalem who doesn't come back somehow awestruck.
And one thing I would really recommend is, and this was helpful for me, is just to be aware of, like, who is your guide? What is their political agenda? What is their religious agenda? What is their scientific agenda? So I think it's very easy, particularly as Americans, for us to go to Jerusalem, to see the sites, just to be told, like, well, there's this, there's that. But I'd really recommend getting off on your own a little bit, maybe finding an alternative guide, somebody different. So if you have a Jewish guide, find a Christian. If you have a Christian guide, find that Jewish guide, and really, find the Muslim guide who will, and there are all kinds of alternative tours that really give you an amazingly, it's like a kaleidoscopic view you can get if you work at it in Jerusalem. And I think you come away with a much richer understanding rather than simply being herded into, one point of view. I think Jerusalem offers us travelers, not just pilgrims, but those people who are just going to see the sites, an opportunity to really see the way that humans interact with each other and have created a really unique religious system. Because Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in Jerusalem, they're all mixed together. They're not as separate as we're led to think.
Yeah.
The Temple Mount, what is now this third holiest site in Islam, is the result of Christians and Muslims and Jews over time creating this amazing structure. And so much of Jerusalem is that. So I think, to really dip into different pieces of that history, and as a cultural anthropologist, I'm sure you can appreciate that. I think you can come away with a much richer view of this place that says so much about who we are as Americans, and as whatever your religious view is. It says so much more about us than it does about the place itself.
Well, always important to make the distinction between the government and the people of any place you go.
Yes.
Your book, I should tell people before we let you go, and if people have comments, is rich with photographs and maps and timelines that were all in your PowerPoint, I'm sure. But you don't have to miss them. They're all here. And the book is extremely accessible because of the reality that it gives you, the storytelling that you've made so brilliantly alive with your words. So we can do this, just the two of us. It was fine. And the historical timeline, because it is such a long period to keep track of. And there are so many things. And we are also distracted by the news and the politics that we forget some of the humanity and the history, and that these are people and they have a past, and they have these artifacts and this history and these fascinating stories to tell down the potato chip aisle. I mean, I think that's just a really important message. Is there anything else that you want people to take from this book? Because I just think it's it's amazing from any perspective. And I like your notion that you should almost, if you go with a Jewish group, you should make sure you get a Christian or a Muslim guide. If you go with a Christian group, you should make sure you get a Jewish guide. I mean, it almost is important to make sure you get that other point of view, and you might come back with a totally different perception of what's really going on the ground and under the ground.
Yeah. And I think that the archaeology is important because it can give us a view that is outside of these strict stories that we're told about Jerusalem. Like Pontius Pilate, it turns out, built a lot of beautiful things in Jerusalem. Who knew? This villain to both Christians and Jews turns out to be one of Jerusalem's great builders. So there are ways in which the science, I think, can break down some of these kind of stale and set stories that we have. And that's where I think, I'm hoping that my book can give people a chance to maybe look at the city a little differently. And science is really a great tool to do that.
What a gift. I mean, really, thank you. That's so important on so many levels. So people can read this book for so many different reasons. I mean, if you're taking a trip, if you have some religious interest, if you have some scientific interest, if you have current affairs interest, political interest, just the history of it. There's so many things, and you're going to be encouraged or invited to confront some things in spite of yourself along the way that I think will just be wonderfully enlightening. So knowing that this is a really huge undertaking, dare I ask you what you're working on next, or are you just taking a big, deep breath and going, oh, I need a break?
Oh, no. I've plunged into something new, although actually I have to say tomorrow I'm leaving for Jerusalem. I've got another assignment for a story for a magazine that I'm very, very excited about. It's not underground, but it's going to be very fun. So, and it's also going to be my first trip there since I left in December 2019 when I finished my reporting just in time, and then got to spend the time in between writing the book. So looking forward to getting back there and pursuing this news story. So stay tuned. It definitely, hopefully will be out in the near future.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your continued efforts. And thank you for sharing all this with us. And people are just saying thank you and wishing you safe travels. And we do the same. Hopefully, when the world is saner in so many ways and COVID is safer, we invite you to come to the BookMark. We're half a block from the ocean. It's, sort of Florida at its best. So please come see us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please come check out Andrew Lawler's book. It's just an amazing read, and I really invite everybody to enjoy it.
There's a question, what is the name? So it's Under Jerusalem, The Buried History of the World's Most Contested City.
Does that help? Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Just we'll know the name.
Thank you for great questions, great conversation. This was so much more fun than a PowerPoint. So,
Oh, good. I'm glad it was more fun for me too. I feel honored. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Come back and see us soon.
Good night.
Take care. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Bye.